When we talk about how wars spiral out of control, there's a natural tendency to assume that escalation is driven by deliberate decisions, clear choices made by leaders who intend to widen the conflict. But in reality, escalation often begins in a much quieter, more subtle way. Like it begins with miscalculation, not irrationality, not recklessness, but misinterpretation. Because at the heart of every conflict is a system of signals. States communicate through actions, military movements, strikes, statements, even silence. And those signals are interpreted by other actors who are trying to understand intent. Are you trying to deter? Are you trying to escalate? Are you sending a warning or preparing for something larger? The problem is that these signals are rarely perfectly clear. They are filtered through assumptions, biases, incomplete intelligence, and sometimes domestic pressure. So what one side sees as a limited controlled action, the other side may interpret as a shift in strategy. And that gap between intention and perception is where escalation begins. Because deterrence, which is supposed to prevent conflict from spiraling, is built entirely on shared understanding. It only works if both sides agree implicitly or explicitly on where the red lines are. What actions will trigger a response? What actions will be tolerated? And perhaps most importantly, what actions signal restraint? But those understandings are fragile. They are not written in stone. They evolve over time. They depend on communication, credibility, and consistency. And when any of those elements weaken, the system becomes unstable. Now, imagine a scenario where a single action crosses a line, but it's not entirely clear which line was crossed. Was it a warning shot? Was it retaliation? Was it the beginning of something more? In that moment of ambiguity, both sides are forced to interpret the situation quickly. And under pressure, interpretation tends to skew toward caution or toward fear. And fear in strategic environments often leads to preemption. Because if you believe the other side is escalating, you may feel compelled to act before they gain an advantage, not because you want to escalate, but because you don't want to be caught off guard. This is the security dilemma in its purest form. Each side believes it is acting defensively. Each side believes it is responding to the other. And yet the net effect is escalation. Now, what makes this particularly dangerous is that it doesn't require a breakdown in rationality. In fact, it can happen precisely because actors are being rational because they are trying to protect their interests in an uncertain environment. And uncertainty is the key variable here. Because when information is incomplete, and it always is in conflict, decision makers must rely on judgment. They must assess risk based on probabilities, not certainties. And in high-stakes situations, the cost of underestimating a threat often feels greater than the cost of overreacting to it. So the system begins to tilt. Caution becomes more aggressive. Restraint becomes more conditional. And actions that were once unthinkable begin to enter the realm of possibility. Now, there's also a psychological layer that operates beneath all of this. Leaders are not just strategic actors. They are human beings operating under pressure. They are influenced by their advisors, by their domestic audiences, and by their own perceptions of credibility and strength. And credibility matters enormously. Because once a state signals that it will respond to certain actions, failing to follow through can weaken its position, not just in the current conflict, but in future ones as well. So, when a line is crossed or appears to be crossed, there is pressure to respond, not necessarily to escalate, but to maintain consistency. But consistency in a fluid situation can become a trap, because each response creates a new expectation. Each expectation creates a new threshold. And over time, the system becomes more rigid, less flexible, and more prone to escalation. This is how the escalation ladder begins, not with a dramatic leap, but with a series of small, interconnected steps, each one justified, each one rational, each one on its own seemingly manageable. But together, they create momentum. And momentum, once established, is difficult to reverse. Now, let's consider the role of communication. In stable environments, communication channels help manage risk. They allow actors to clarify intent, to signal restraint, to de-escalate when necessary. But in moments of tension, those channels can become strained or even break down entirely. And when communication breaks down, assumptions take over. Intentions are guessed rather than understood. Signals are interpreted without confirmation. And the likelihood of miscalculation increases dramatically. At that point, the system is no longer operating on shared understanding. It is operating on parallel narratives. Each side telling its own story, each side believing it is responding appropriately, and each side moving one step further up the escalation ladder. So, when we talk about the fragility of deterrence, we're not talking about weakness in military capability. We're talking about fragility in perception, in communication, in trust. Because deterrence is not just about what you can do, it's about what the other side believes you will do and why. And once that belief becomes uncertain, the system begins to shift from stability to tension, from tension to escalation. and from escalation to something much harder to control. So the real danger is not the first strike, it's the first misunderstanding, because that is the moment when intention and perception begin to diverge. And once they do, every action that follows is built on that divergence, which leads us to a critical reflection. If escalation begins not with aggression, but with misinterpretation, then the most important question is not how strong a response is, but how clearly we understand the signals we send and the assumptions we choose to act on. Once that first miscalculation occurs, escalation rarely happens all at once. It moves in increments, small steps, manageable responses, each one framed as necessary, justified, even restrained. And that's precisely what makes it so dangerous, because it doesn't feel like a loss of control. It feels like control being exercised. This is what we can think of as the normalization of risk. At the beginning of a conflict, there are clear boundaries. Certain actions are considered too extreme, too destabilizing, too likely to provoke a severe response. These boundaries act as informal limits, guardrails that shape behavior even in tense situations. But those guardrails are not fixed. They are psychological as much as strategic. And like any psychological boundary, they can shift over time. So what happens first is a small breach. An action that might previously have been considered escalatory is taken, but framed as limited, proportional, a response, not an initiation. And because it is framed that way, it becomes easier to accept, both domestically and internationally. Then comes the response to that action, again limited, again justified, again presented as necessary. And with each exchange, something subtle begins to change. The definition of what is acceptable starts to expand. This is how escalation becomes incremental. Not through a single dramatic shift, but through a series of adjustments, each one moving the line just a little further, each one redefining the baseline. And over time, actions that once seemed unthinkable begin to feel normal. Now, from a strategic perspective, this process is often deliberate. Actors may choose to escalate gradually in order to test boundaries, to probe the other side's tolerance, to see how far they can go without triggering a disproportionate response. This is sometimes referred to as salami slicing, making small gains that individually do not justify a major response, but collectively alter the strategic landscape. But here's the key insight. Even when escalation is intentional, it is rarely fully controlled, because the other side is also adapting. They are also recalibrating their thresholds. They are also deciding what is acceptable and what is not. So you have two parallel processes unfolding at the same time. Each side is normalizing its own actions. Each side is adjusting to the other's behavior. And in that interaction, the overall level of risk continues to rise. Now, let's bring in the psychological dimension. Human beings have a remarkable ability to adapt to changing conditions. What feels dangerous at first can become familiar over time. What feels extreme can begin to feel routine. And this applies to decision makers as well. The more frequently they operate in a high-risk environment, the more accustomed they become to it, the more comfortable they become with uncertainty, and the more willing they may be to accept actions that previously would have been considered too risky. This is not recklessness. It's adaptation. But adaptation in this context can lead to a kind of strategic desensitization. Because if each step feels manageable, it becomes harder to recognize the cumulative effect. It's like climbing a ladder without looking down. Each step is small. Each step is justified. But before you realize it, you are much higher than you intended to be. And climbing down is no longer simple. Now let's consider the role of signaling in this process. Every action sends a message. But in an environment of incremental escalation, those messages can become distorted. Because when both sides are escalating gradually, it becomes difficult to distinguish between a signal of intent and a continuation of the pattern. Is this latest action a warning? Is it a test? Or is it just another step in the sequence? That ambiguity increases the risk of misinterpretation. And misinterpretation, as we've already seen, is one of the primary drivers of escalation. At the same time, domestic pressures begin to play a larger role, because as the conflict intensifies, even incrementally, public expectations begin to shift. What was once seen as a strong response may now be seen as insufficient. What was once considered a bold move may now feel routine, and leaders operating within that environment may feel pressure to go further, not necessarily because the strategic situation demands it, but because the political context does. This creates another feedback loop. Escalation drives expectations. Expectations drive further escalation, and the system begins to move with its own momentum. Now, here's where the real danger lies, because incremental escalation creates the illusion of control. Each step feels deliberate. Each response feels measured, and because there is no single moment of dramatic escalation, it can be difficult to recognize when the situation has fundamentally changed. But at some point, the accumulation of these steps crosses a threshold, a point where the level of conflict is no longer easily reversible, a point where the options for de-escalation become more limited, and a point where the risks of further escalation increase significantly. And yet, because the path to that point was gradual, it may not feel like a sudden shift. It may feel like a continuation, and that's what makes it so dangerous. Because systems that change gradually are often harder to correct than systems that change abruptly. Now, from a philosophical perspective, what we are really seeing here is the power of incremental change. How small decisions made in sequence can lead to large outcomes, how rational actions taken individually can produce irrational results collectively, and how the absence of a clear breaking point can make it difficult to recognize when a system is approaching its limits. So when we think about escalation, we shouldn't just focus on the dramatic moments. We should focus on the process, the slow shift in perception, the gradual expansion of what is acceptable, the normalization of risk, because that is where the real movement happens. Not in the headlines, but in the patterns. And that leads us to a critical reflection. If escalation doesn't feel like escalation while it's happening, then the real question is not when the conflict becomes dangerous, but whether we can recognize the danger before it becomes irreversible. As escalation continues step by step, something else begins to happen, something that fundamentally changes the nature of the conflict. More actors start to enter the picture, and with each new actor, the system becomes more complex, more layered, and ultimately more difficult to control. Because at the beginning of a conflict, even a tense one, there is often a degree of centralization, a limited number of decision makers, a relatively clear structure of communication, a shared understanding, however fragile, of who is involved and what the stakes are. But that clarity doesn't last. As the conflict intensifies, it begins to draw in others, sometimes intentionally through alliances and coordinated responses, sometimes indirectly through proxy groups, regional interests, or opportunistic engagement, and sometimes unintentionally as the effects of the conflict spill across borders and into new domains. And each new participant brings something different, different objectives, different timelines, different thresholds for risk. This is where control begins to fragment. Because once multiple actors are involved, there is no longer a single center of gravity, no single authority that can define the pace or direction of escalation. Instead, you have a network of decision makers, each responding to their own incentives and constraints. And in a network, coordination becomes much harder. Even allies who broadly share goals may disagree on tactics, on timing, on how far to go and when to stop. And those differences, even if subtle, can create gaps in communication, gaps in expectations, gaps in action. And in high-stakes environments, gaps create risk. Now, let's consider the role of non-state actors. In many modern conflicts, especially in the Middle East, non-state groups are not peripheral. They are central. They operate with varying degrees of autonomy, but they are often aligned loosely or tightly with state actors. And that creates another layer of complexity, because these groups do not always operate under the same constraints as states. They may be less sensitive to international pressure, less concerned with diplomatic consequences, more driven by ideological motivations or local dynamics, which means their actions can be less predictable and sometimes more escalatory. Now, imagine a scenario where a non-state actor takes an action that escalates the conflict, an attack, a strike, a provocation. The state that is loosely aligned with that group may not have directly ordered the action, but it may still be held responsible. So the response comes, and now you have escalation driven not by direct state-to-state interaction, but by a chain of indirect relationships. This is how conflicts expand beyond their original boundaries. Not through a single decision, but through a series of interconnected reactions. Now, from a psychological perspective, this fragmentation creates a sense of uncertainty, because when there are multiple actors, it becomes harder to predict behavior, harder to interpret signals, harder to identify intentions. And uncertainty, as we've seen, tends to push actors toward more cautious or more aggressive postures, but rarely toward inaction. Because in a fragmented system, waiting can feel like losing control. So actors act sometimes to assert influence, sometimes to preempt others, and sometimes simply to avoid being sidelined. And each of those actions adds another layer to the conflict. Now let's talk about alliances. Alliances are designed to provide stability, to create a framework for cooperation and collective response. But in a rapidly escalating conflict, alliances can also become sources of pressure. Because once you are aligned with another actor, their actions begin to affect you. If they escalate, you may feel compelled to support them. If they hold back, you may feel constrained. And in some cases, alliance commitments can pull actors into conflicts they might otherwise have avoided. This is not a failure of alliances. It's a reflection of how interconnected the system has become. But it does mean that escalation is no longer a bilateral process. It is multilateral. and multilateral systems are inherently more complex. Now, here's the critical point. As more actors become involved, the ability to manage escalation decreases. Not because any one actor loses capability, but because no single actor has full visibility or control over the entire system. Decisions are made in parallel, actions are taken independently, and the overall trajectory of the conflict becomes the product of many decisions rather than a few. This is what we mean by the loss of central control. And once that happens, the conflict begins to take on a life of its own. It is no longer just the result of strategic planning. It is the result of interaction, of momentum, of a system moving forward driven by multiple forces at once. Now, from a philosophical standpoint, this raises an important question about agency. Who is actually in control of the conflict? Is it the original actors, the most powerful ones, or is it the system itself? Because in highly interconnected environments, outcomes are often emergent. They are not designed. They are not planned. They emerge from the interaction of many parts, and that makes them difficult to predict and even harder to reverse. So, when we talk about escalation in a multi-actor environment, we are really talking about complexity. Complexity that grows with each new participant, complexity that reduces clarity, and complexity that increases the risk of unintended consequences. Because the more moving parts there are, the greater the chance that something will happen that no one fully anticipated. And that's the point where escalation becomes truly dangerous. Not because it is fast, but because it is diffuse, spread across actors, spread across regions, spread across intentions. And once it reaches that point, bringing it back under control becomes a very different challenge. Not a question of stopping one actor, but of stabilizing an entire system. And that leads us to a final reflection. When control is no longer centralized and outcomes are shaped by a network of independent decisions, the real question is not who escalates, but whether anyone still has the ability to de-escalate once the system itself begins to move forward. And as this system grows more complex, more actors, more signals, more uncertainty, something else begins to take hold. Something less visible, but arguably more powerful than any military capability or strategic doctrine. That is psychological momentum. Because escalation is not just a sequence of events. It is a state of mind. At a certain point in a conflict, decisions are no longer made in isolation. They are shaped by what has already happened, by what has been said, by what has been lost, and by what leaders believe they can no longer afford to concede. This is where momentum begins to build, not because anyone explicitly chooses it, but because each step forward makes stepping back more difficult. And this is the paradox. The more a conflict escalates, the harder it becomes to de-escalate, not because options disappear, but because they become politically, psychologically, and strategically costly. Let's start with the idea of credibility. In international conflict, credibility is everything. It's the belief that when a state signals intent, it will follow through. And once that credibility is established, it becomes something leaders feel compelled to protect. So when a state makes a threat or sets a red line or takes a strong position, it creates an expectation, not just externally, but internally. Domestic audiences begin to watch closely, allies begin to calculate based on that stance, and adversaries begin to test it. Now imagine what happens when that position is challenged. If a leader chooses to step back, to de-escalate, to compromise, it may be strategically wise, but it may also be perceived as weakness. And perception, again, is critical. Because in the middle of a conflict, leaders are not just managing external threats, they are managing internal pressures, political opposition, public opinion, institutional expectations. And those pressures often push in one direction, forward to maintain strength, forward to preserve credibility, forward to avoid the appearance of retreat. Now, this doesn't mean leaders want escalation. It means they become constrained by it. Because once a narrative is established, once a conflict is framed in terms of right and wrong, strength and weakness, victory and loss, it becomes harder to shift that narrative without consequence. And that narrative shapes decisions. Now let's consider the role of emotion. We often think of geopolitics as purely rational, calculated, strategic. But in reality, emotion plays a significant role, especially over time. Fear, for example, can drive preemptive action. Anger can drive retaliation. Pride can prevent compromise. And loss, whether human, material, or symbolic, can create a sense of obligation to continue. Because once sacrifices have been made, stopping can feel like invalidating those sacrifices. This is where conflicts begin to sustain themselves. Not because the original objectives are still clear or achievable, but because the cost of stopping feels too high. Now add to this the concept of sunk cost. The more resources, military, economic, political, that are invested in a conflict, the harder it becomes to disengage, because disengagement means accepting that those investments did not produce the desired outcome. And that is a difficult conclusion for any leadership to accept. So instead, the tendency is to continue, to push a little further, to try to achieve a result that justifies the cost. And that creates a kind of inertia, a forward motion that is no longer entirely strategic, but is driven by the need to make sense of what has already happened. Now, let's bring this back to the broader system. Because when multiple actors are all experiencing this psychological momentum at the same time, the effect is amplified. Each side believes it must continue. Each side feels constrained by its own commitments. And each side interprets the actions of others through that same lens. So even signals of restraint can be misread. Even attempts at de-escalation can be viewed with suspicion. And the space for compromise begins to shrink. This is what we can think of as the point of no return. Not a single moment, but a gradual closing of options, a narrowing of pathways, a situation where even if all actors recognize the risk, they find themselves unable or unwilling to change course during. And at that point, the conflict is no longer being actively directed. It is being carried forward by momentum, by perception, by the weight of past decisions. Now, from a philosophical perspective, this raises a fundamental question about agency and control. At what point do leaders stop shaping events and start being shaped by them? Because in theory, every decision is a choice. But in practice, choices are constrained by context, by history, by expectation, and by the psychological environment in which they are made. So, when we talk about escalation spiraling out of control, we are not just talking about a failure of strategy. We are talking about a loss of flexibility, a loss of the ability to pause, to reassess, to change direction. And that loss is often gradual, almost invisible, until it is too late. And that is what makes psychological momentum so powerful, because it does not announce itself. It builds quietly, step by step, decision by decision, until the system reaches a point where stopping feels harder than continuing. And once that point is reached, the path forward is no longer chosen freely, it is followed. Which brings us to a final reflection. If the most dangerous phase of escalation is not when conflict begins, but when it becomes psychologically irreversible, then the real responsibility is not just to manage power, but to recognize the moment when continuing feels inevitable and to have the courage to stop anyway.